Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Advance. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you stand throughout Australia, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Maria MacNamara, and I'm the CEO of Advance.org. We're the trusted platform that connects global Australians with one another and with Australia. And we do this to unlock the economic and cultural opportunities through collaboration, investment, and innovation. We recognise and we celebrate the achievements of global Australians who are at the forefront of their field to inspire the next generation. And today's roundtable is a demonstration of the power of this very simple idea. I extend a very, very warm welcome to colleagues from across Australia, from Japan, Indonesia, and the United States. I welcome the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos AO, Australia's Ambassador to the United States, Jason Falinski MP, and our Chairman Emeritus, Ken Allen. I also welcome members of the Advance Board, our Advance Global Ambassadors, and members of our Advance Asian Advisory Council. I have a very special and warm welcome to the women of IWFA who are here today. Before I move the focus to our special guest, Zoe Daniel, let me share with you briefly how today's program will unfold. I'll introduce Zoe and invite her to make her opening remarks. We'll then move to a facilitated Q&A, and we'll close and have you back at your desks promptly. Please keep your camera on and your sound on mute until you're invited to ask your question. And with that, let me introduce the very marvellous special guest, Zoe Daniel. Zoe was the former US Bureau Chief at the ABC, and she spent the past 4 years in Washington, D.C. With the ABC. Before her assignment to the USA, she was the ABC's Southeast Asia correspondent from 2009 to 2013, and she was Africa correspondent from 2005 until 2007. Zoe is a long-time television and radio journalist, and she co-hosted the international news program, The World, on News 24 and Australia Plus. She has a very personal style of reporting, which provides a lot of context around local life and culture. She's an eyewitness reporter and stands out for speaking directly with people who are affected by a situation. And she travels to places to understand what's going on. She's the author of Storyteller, which provides a very personal insight into her life as a foreign correspondent. And she's done that while juggling a family. Zoe's an advocate for working mothers, and she's often stated that it's extremely challenging independently of the job that she's already doing. There's much that Zoe has achieved in her lifetime of work. And with that, I welcome her today to share her remarks and her insights. It's a privilege to have you with us, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. It's great of you to join us. I will make a few opening remarks. I haven't prepared anything particularly formal because I think that in this kind of context, a Q&A tends to work better. It will get to the core of what you would like to hear from me, but I think it's worth laying some context around my history in the US, particularly. As Maria said, I arrived in the States at the end of 2015. So I was lucky enough to be an eyewitness to the 2016 election campaign and the election of Donald Trump, and also to cover his first 3 years in office. I think the first thing that I would say, and it's not particularly revealing or illuminating in any way, but quite obvious, that when I got the job as US Bureau Chief in mid-2015, the expectation was that Hillary Clinton would win the election, that Donald Trump was effectively a novelty candidate, and that once the election had happened, everything would revert to normal, in inverted commas. Obviously, once I arrived, things unfolded very differently, and it became apparent to me very quickly that the election probably wouldn't play out as everyone had assumed. I arrived before Christmas in 2015, and in the new year of 2016 effectively launched straight into covering the caucuses and primaries around the country. I lived in the US for 4 years. I'm back in Melbourne now, but I've been to roughly 45 states during that 4-year period, and much of that was during 2016, although obviously I travelled extensively throughout the posting. I think the thing that Maria said that's important is that my history in reporting began in rural Australia. I was a presenter of the Country Hour, our rural affairs program on the ABC. I've lived in every state except Queensland. I've spent a lot of time as a field reporter, and my basic interest and focus in reporting is getting out and talking to ordinary people and trying to delve into their perspective, to understand their thinking, and then in a political context that goes to what their various decision-making might be. In terms of covering the 2016 campaign and then the Trump presidency, I think that approach was extremely helpful, particularly in the sense that the level of division, political division in the United States, economic division and social division, perhaps means that frequently people of different backgrounds don't necessarily interact with each other. There is perhaps a socio-economic but also a geographic divide to some degree, where there is a more progressive perspective in many of the major cities, but people who are living in the inland states, the less populated states, the more rural and agricultural and industrial states have quite a different view on how their country should be run. I think in that sense, I learned a lot, spending most of my time outside DC during 2016. The thing that was kind of weird about that was that what I was hearing from people in the places that I was travelling to was very different to what I was hearing when I was in Washington. And it was a case of trying to navigate what was true, and then try to get a sense of how that might play into the way that people would vote. It was quite a conflicted time for me, because the places that I was travelling to, places like Ohio, Kentucky, the Carolinas, particularly North Carolina, Western Pennsylvania, a lot of the places that we spent most of our time during the election campaign, most people that I spoke to, and I'm not generalising, most people that I spoke to were voting for Donald Trump. And they were very clear about that. I've told many stories about the fact that even a couple of weeks before the election, we did a road trip through Western Pennsylvania, and obviously Pennsylvania was a state that was expected to go to the Democrats because of the large population in the major cities. But driving through Western Pennsylvania, we barely saw a Hillary Clinton yard sign. Just about every yard that we passed by had a Trump-Pence Make America Great Again sign in its yard. The general view of people that we spoke to across those states was that, firstly, they didn't trust Hillary Clinton, and there was a very personal set of issues about her that people objected to in regard to her time as Secretary of State particularly, but also just being a member of the Washington establishment. But there was also just a deeper sense of wanting to elect the anti-politician, someone who was going to bring something fresh to Washington. And even though many of Donald Trump's supporters that I've spent time with objected to his various rhetoric, particularly around treatment of women, racial issues, immigration, perhaps, they were prepared to tolerate some of that, and also his behaviour on Twitter, for the sake of getting a president who was going to be direct, blunt, not controlled by the establishment, and essentially take his own path in terms of leadership. obviously here we are, and I could go on about what it was like covering Donald Trump once he actually got elected. It's interesting that 2016 was a crazy election campaign year for us in the Bureau in Washington, but 2017 was actually the year that was kind of really off the wall in terms of news, in that just about every day something completely wild happened, whether it was Donald Trump withdrawing from international agreements, sacking staff resigning, constant turnover of people in the White House administration and those kinds of things. But just to sort of fast forward to where we are now, I think there's a couple of things to point out before we go to questions. One is that the people that I'm speaking to who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and I'm still in touch with them now because I'm writing a book, many of them are still going to vote for him in 2020. I think that one thing that I learnt covering the 2016 election and also the first few years of the administration was that the way that the administration and Donald Trump's behaviour is perceived internationally is quite different to how it's perceived domestically. And I think in a domestic context, just from my perspective, and plainly I'm not American, so it's just an expat's view, but the country is politically very divided. A lot of people have a very set view politically, and they tend to watch, listen to and read things that feed into their existing perspective. It's very different to an Australian environment where, although our media is becoming increasingly polarised, we don't have as big a media market. So our media can't be quite so narrow in the way that it delivers news and perspectives. So you automatically tend to get a slightly broader perspective on things than you would in the US if you're watching and listening to particular things. I think that to make an assumption now, a couple of months out from the election, that it will be a landslide, a rout in favour of Joe Biden is something that I would definitely not subscribe to. But that said, I know all the polls look that way, and it would have to be a much bigger correction this year than it was in 2016 in regard to how that polling is looking. But I think that I've, having been in part burnt by the polls at that time where I thought I was going crazy because I really thought Donald Trump was going to win the election because of the people that I was speaking to. But then every time I came back to DC to have people saying to me, but the polls say Hillary's got it, even the day before the election, according to everyone, Hillary had it. And I really didn't believe that. So I have a very healthy skepticism about the polls. I also would say that Donald Trump has an exceptional capacity to control the narrative and the conversation, and that the way that we've seen news move and information flow in that intervening period between 2016 and 2020 demonstrates how quickly that narrative can change. We're in very much a 24-hour fast news cycle. And the only thing that's really caused the president to lose control of that has been COVID-19. So if we'd say that we're, 10 weeks out from the election now, my view is that a lot can still change in that time because the news narrative tends to move very quickly. So yeah, just from those preliminary remarks, I'm keen to take questions. I think that probably will get to what you'd like to know from me. So back to you, Maria.
Thank you very much. And there are so many questions. We've had people send them through. I might just kick off with a couple of my own. I guess when you look at the United States, it's a country that, or a nation that has an irrepressible energy, and it reinvents itself every time it needs to. It pulls itself out of whatever hole, or it redirects as it needs to, and its ingenuity and innovation is just a hallmark. And capitalism in the way that it's expressed by the United States is something quite confronting to Australians, because, you know, our understanding of capitalism and what you see in the United States in its raw form is just so different. But my question, I guess, sits at a very personal level, a human level. When will the American people be tired? You know, when will all the agitation and the sense of constant aggression and crisis, when will it wear them down, if ever?
Well, I agree with you that it's an incredibly vibrant, just a complete wow of a place as far as I'm concerned. And the thing that fascinates me about it most, I think, is that you've essentially got a series of small countries within one country. Yeah. And I certainly wouldn't say each state is a different country, but you very much have regions that sort of operate in culturally very different ways in terms of the language, the food, their approach to life, their outlook. And so from that perspective, you have a lot of differing views. And not sort of no sense of perhaps a sort of nationalised culture, even in the way that a country like Australia has. The states' rights are so much stronger. That sense of state and regional independence is so much stronger. So in a way that breeds perhaps conflict, but also creativity, because you end up with, you know, a whole lot of different sparks coming together, and that's what creates, you know, the fantastic place that the US is. I mean, in terms of people being tired, I think a lot of people are tired, particularly in areas that have seen huge industrial change in fairly recent history. And, you know, people, a lot of perhaps what's happening politically is generated by fear, fear of change, but also fear of what the future holds, a sense of, will my children be able to have as good a life or a better life than me in a country that offers so much promise? And also people have great expectations of themselves and the countries to sort of deliver them a particular kind of life. One thing that struck me particularly during 2016 was that at the end of the day, no matter what was going on within the political narrative that was interesting to people like me and other insiders in Washington or people who have a sort of political perspective, many of those who I was speaking to on the ground really just cared about their job, how much money they were earning, how secure their employment is or was, their capacity to send their children to college or enable their children's education, and what the future for their children might look like, and also what their local community or their part of their city or state might look like going forward. And that comes back to, again, a little bit what I was saying about people being capable of tolerating some of Donald Trump's more negative qualities for the sake of what they thought he could deliver to them. And circling that back around to 2020, that plays in quite a lot, I think, to what happens over the next couple of months. Because to me, at the beginning of this year, back in February, Donald Trump was just walking straight back into re-election. I had absolutely no question whatsoever that he would be re-elected in November, back in early March. Coronavirus has thrown just a complete unreadable spanner into that. But it also poses a whole lot of questions around, well, the economy was looking pretty good. Those who voted for Donald Trump believed that he had ticked a lot of boxes in terms of what he had promised them in terms of tax cuts and productivity and rolling back regulation and delivering Supreme Court justices and also judges in the lower courts and various other things like that. Will they blame him for an uncontrollable global event that has crashed the economy? And to what degree do they delve into the White House's management of that and then sheet that home to him at the election? And I think that if you assume that many people vote based on their economic situation, that's very central to how that result might look at the end of the year.
So I guess just picking up on that, when you're looking at the US economy at the moment, you've got the rising unemployment, COVID triggering the rising unemployment, you've got the stoush with China, you have the enormous gap and the hollowing out of the middle. The question of hope comes through, you know, what have they got to look forward to? And I guess picking up your point is, you know, is there enough of a belief amongst Americans that by retaining the status quo, it will get better. They will see it through. You know, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's always the million-dollar question for most leaders. But I guess the only other thing was, you were in the States during a spate of a lot of schoolyard shootings, and the power of the NRA at the time was very strong. I note that the leadership is currently dealing with fraud issues. What give us a sense of what it is like to be in that environment where, you know, yet another school shooting, you know, there's 20, 30 children who are no longer with us. How does the American psyche deal with that? And as an expat in that environment, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, two things. One, just very quickly before I move on to that, I think going to your question around the status quo and hope and how that figures into decision making, I think the question around that becomes, does Biden provide hope for people, or is Biden actually a reversion to the status quo? Will he inspire people, and does he inspire hope, and is he enough to inspire people who, I think Donald Trump's base is still solid. So does Biden inspire people who might not otherwise have voted, or who are sort of swinging in the centre there? So that's the point I'd make about that. In regard to school shootings, well, it's very difficult to be particularly an expat parent in the United States with children of school age. We almost didn't go because we were concerned about how safe our kids would be in school. Obviously, once we got there, school operates much the same way as it does here, and the kids get up and go to school and they come home, and that's all just the way that the days pass by. But I think as a journalist, it's quite different, because when not only school shootings, but mass shootings happen around the country, we're very focused on those. And all of us in the bureaus have spent substantial time on scene after mass shootings at schools and other places. The Orlando nightclub massacre is probably the one that comes most front of mind. I mean, I was bureau chief through a period of several worst ever mass shootings in Orlando, in Vegas, and there were several school shootings through that period, and it's incredibly frightening. However, kids have to go to school, and so this is just an anxiety that I think parents learn to live with. But every time, if I could sort of paint a picture of what it's like working in an international news bureau, where we're all sitting at our desks as you would expect in an office, with banks of television screens with boxes of different channels, and we have a squawk box where someone from the White House or Associated Press in New York would speak and say, attention all stations, attention all stations. We have an alert for a shooting at a school in Florida. And then suddenly all of those banks of televisions would turn to an aerial shot over that school. And there's just an instant feeling of just feeling sick. And as bureau chief, you know, I often say that my job's 90% logistics and 10% journalism in that role, because you instantly have to start thinking, how bad is it? How bad is it going to be? How do we get there? Who do I send? How do I get them there? And so while we're actually trying to monitor an unfolding situation of the extent of what's happened, we're also working on logistics of having to move people. And it can be very difficult to move. It's kind of easier to move yourself than to tell someone else to go and cover a mass shooting, which is, quite possibly one of the most traumatic things that you'll ever witness in terms of having to cover the aftermath of a news event. And I think particularly as a parent, you see all of the parents descend on the school and they'll be waiting outside the school to see if their children come out. And it's incredibly distressing to be on site watching that.
And so when the Black Lives Matter movement started just recently with all of the demonstrations, that was, it's almost like, we saw the tipping point being reached and we saw the reaction to it. But to see it through Australian eyes and to experience it through Australian eyes is something very different. I don't know that Australians have a sense of, or many Australians have a sense of just how America relied on the Black population to build it. So what do you see when you see the Black Lives Matter conversation unfolding in America at the moment and its role in this upcoming election?
Well, look, I view it with some frustration, as I think that a lot of Americans do, in the sense that this got more attention this time round in a way, but this is something that happens on repeat. This situation of African-American men getting shot or killed by police, the extraordinary gun violence and sort of outweighing of the deaths in the African-American community in places like Chicago, the fact that it's such an intractable problem. But I think more deeply, that sense of trying to understand what it would be like to have that hanging over you for your whole life, and to have that hanging over your children for their whole life. If you're stopped in a car, your risk of being hurt by the people who are employed to protect you by society. So I think that's what runs very deep. This latest iteration of the Black Lives Matter protests and situation, I think it's fantastic that it got that much attention globally. And it seems to have moved things forward perhaps in all sorts of different ways. I mean, there are, even in Australia now, there's a focus on diversity in media, for example, and having more voices in our sort of media landscape, and perhaps in our business landscape, in our board landscape, and all those sorts of things. And to me, that's the shift that we need to see, because that's when the change will happen. But it is a little frustrating to see it sort of come up as a big story. And that, I'm a journalist, but I really don't like that word, because I feel like it just sort of boxes something into a particular sort of position, and then it passes. But getting back to the sort of the way the news wheel turns, that wheel's turned again. So it's kind of like you need to wait for it to come back up and up and up. And how many times does it have to come up before it actually results in something?
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to take a question from Melanie Brock. Melanie is the Advance Ambassador in Japan. She's a live wire, and we love the fact that she comes to our roundtables because she gives us such a unique perspective. Melanie.
Goodness gracious, set up as a live wire means I need to be sprightly at 7:15 or whatever it is, 7:30. Hello, Zoe, and thank you, Maria. I just thought I'd let everybody on the screen know that Zoe gets the Connect Australia Awards for a very specific reason. When I took a brief break from the immediate times in the tsunami, I was in Thailand, and Zoe bought me a beer and chicken rice with her family, and I've never forgotten that, because she really extended the hand to people who in the region. So that was good on you, Zoe. Even without a US election, Zoe, you know that Australian media organisations, well, broadly speaking, global organisations, spend a lot of resources on and in the United States. Not so the case in Asia. As you know, it's a struggle to get stories covered. The reduction in the number of correspondents, even with the ABC, over the region, means that we just don't get the stories out. And I know it's a very important year, and forgive me, Ambassador, for saying that the US might be anything but important, because I know it is. But the relationship that the United States has with countries in Asia, even if you looked at it from that angle, is important for Australia, really important for Australia. I wonder, in these times of pandemic, with us being a little bit more insular, and understandably so, focusing on our domestic markets, what do media organisations, and particularly in this case the ABC, and I know I don't want to particularly put you on the spot, but you know, some of the commercial organisations might not have that that sort of commitment or view. But what do we do to make sure that it's not just a string of state premiers announcing that there were 3 people with coronavirus, which I understand for that particular area is a difficult thing. How do we make sure that we don't go that way, and that we just broaden our view to understand and get a collective sort of approach?
Well, I think the one thing I would say is that when I was in Bangkok, and I was a Southeast Asia correspondent there and lived in Southeast Asia for 5 years, is that the engagement with the audience, I would say, was higher than it was when I was US bureau chief. And perhaps that's to do with the time difference, in that when something's happening in Asia, people can engage with you directly while it's unfolding. Whereas often with the time difference in the US, the way that we're reporting is that things are sort of happening in the night or morning for the next day. I do think that news organisations undervalue the level of interest in the region. I think that a lot of people in Australia, because they've travelled to various parts of Asia, even as tourists, or perhaps have business interests or family living in some parts of Southeast Asia or other parts of Asia, that they do feel a connection. And also to the Pacific, which I think is a huge black spot for us in terms of news coverage, not only for the ABC, but just generally. I think that, you know, there are various organisations trying to facilitate more coverage in Asia that is relevant to Australians. But I think too that it's the way perhaps in which that coverage is done to try to engage the audience and to, you know, make them feel that it resonates with them in some way. I think that, for example, looking at Japan, 15, 20 years ago, around the time that I first became a correspondent, I felt like there was a lot more coverage of Australian business in Japan, the economic relationship with Japan. That's kind of gone away. And I think, you know, I think that's a fail. And I think perhaps news organisations undervalue the fact that the audience is actually really interested in that. We tend to focus a lot on China now, and it kind of sort of outweighs a lot of our other Asia coverage when it comes to the economic and business stories that we could be doing. So, yeah, I really take your point. I mean, I would say that, for example, the Judith Neilson Institute is doing quite a bit of work on trying to facilitate more coverage in Asia. I know the Asia Society is trying to do the same. So I definitely think that there is a gap there that could be filled. But unfortunately, we're also in an era of ever decreasing news budgets. And when it comes to commercial media organisations, they hardly have any correspondence anymore.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you so much. And Tom Finnegan, you've got a question that you'd like to ask. You can take yourself off mute.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, Zoe. I'm very interested in your opinion from last election to now about the effect of the digital impact on the American election, and it's affecting all of us. And we saw, you know, the Mercers switching, I think, Kellyanne Conway from being behind Ted Cruz to Trump, and then pushing, and then, you know, by Cambridge Analytica's own admission that they felt that they swung the election by maybe 1 to 2%. And we've seen a real move with people online to draw themselves towards conversations that reinforce their own worldviews, and so a tribalism of the online conversation. And America's really split now. So did you notice the impact of that social media targeting while you were going around talking to people last election? What impact do you think it'll have on this year's US election?
I don't think we paid it enough attention. One thing I would say, just sort of breaking out the Russian influence aspect, that when that first became a story in sort of mid to late 2016, it hardly got any attention. When the DNC was hacked and that Russia story sort of started developing, no one really paid much attention to it. I remember saying a couple of times in live crosses that I was really surprised that it wasn't getting more interest, because it seemed to me to be, well, firstly, completely bizarre, but also quite important. I mean, as history will show, it ended up being, quite a major part of the Trump presidency in terms of the Mueller report, investigations, and all those sorts of things. So, I mean, I think we're talking about a couple of different things. I think we're talking about social media and the internet being used as a deliberate tool by those who want to influence in some way or control what's going on. And that's obviously very strategic. And then I think you're also talking about the social media companies, the power of what they have and the way that those algorithms work and the way that people are drawn to particular content. I was talking to someone who's quite expert in this the other day around negative or false information in regard to COVID-19, the whole conspiracy theory, this is a hoax kind of issue. And I was sort of posing the question of, well, could you, as a social media organisation or a government, flood that social media platform with correct information in order to try to push the algorithm back the other way to get people away from this viral false news? The thing is, and he's an expert in this field, he said, well, the problem is that the negative, incorrect stuff is always the stuff that will go viral because people don't want to read the boring, truthful stuff. So there's a couple of things there. One is that perhaps governments could work better with the social media organisations to try to correct their algorithms to prevent that kind of viral response. And I know the likes of Facebook are already working on this, for example, in the lead up to elections, whether they sort of tone down that viral capacity so that things are not as shareable, so that incorrect information doesn't spread so easily. But also perhaps we need to think about how we better deliver factual information to make it more interesting to people. If you look at Facebook in regard to their COVID-19 info, for example, there's a button that you can press on and it basically takes you to a whole lot of information from the WHO, which is fine. But is the average person actually going to be interested in sitting down and reading that? No. So we have to find better ways of delivering information so that people will be interested in it, even if it's actual factual information as opposed to incorrect information that's designed to send them down a rabbit hole.
Thank you. We've got Jaclyn Lee-Joe, who's just returned to Australia. She was the global marketing director at Netflix until recently. And just picking up on that point, Jackie, I'd be interested in your perspective on the marketing of good news and the influence of social media in relation.
I was actually, sorry, I just come into it, but I was just going to build on what you said, Zoe, because in Taiwan, in fact, part of the factor behind the success of the ability for the government to kind of go out and message has been to use more virally oriented tactics and strategies around communicating the news. And they've been able to do that to the point where there is more talkability about the news that they are sharing and populating out into the community than a lot of the other negative news that's coming out. So I think there's a real value in what you talk about in relation to And I wonder about that actually as relates to the Biden-Harris campaign, you know, in terms of how they can kind of better utilize those tactics in a world where physical campaigning will not be a reality in the next few months. And the notion of, you know, the importance of COVID and maybe the aspects of kind of economic hardship hitting people for real, driving home that alongside what is a very conceptual kind of tactic around democracy, you know, which is, you know, the lead message that they've come out to roost on. So maybe, you know, they've got a broader spread of tools and tactics at their disposal on potential messages than they would have had, of course, pre-COVID to kind of look through. Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, Maria, actually, to kind of get, you know, positive messaging out. You know, I think what we have found in the time of COVID at Netflix has been a unbelievable level of intensity around global conversations. They tend to kind of ratchet up with a level of kind of accelerant that we have really not seen before, and then they kind of dissipate. And the need to kind of continue to innovate and change our editorial formats in order to kind of, you know, feed the veracity and the kind of hunger of the audiences that we've got right now has been quite a challenge for people like us. And what we're finding as well, Maria, is that, you know, shows that we thought were small shows that probably really were only going to be, you know, in the purview of a Polish audience, for example, in the case of 365 Days, which was really a 50 Shades of Grey tatty piece that we kind of had bought on license, that the algorithm had started to pick up, you know, trends on it. And because you've got audiences going deeper into our catalogue than ever before, you're finding that conversations and titles that you thought were just isolated to Poland have then picked up a pace around the world. And then, of course, our top 10 algorithms feed it through, and then that adds to a whole nother level of kind of, you know, viewership. And that's made it difficult, certainly on the marketing side, to kind of be able to straddle and manage global conversations, because the interpretation of that piece in Poland was very much, you know, we know it's 50 Shades of Grey tat, you know, we know what we're getting when we kind of go and click in. But when you see that piece reflected back into viewing of audiences in Latin America, where there is a lot more misogyny and, you know, there's a lot less tolerance for that type of content and a misinterpretation, if you like, of what that could look like. And then that spreads into, you know, 15 or 16-year-old girls on TikTok actually then kind of picking up those. It has a whole different level of meaning and implication. And we've certainly been trying to deal with that. The implication on Black Lives Matters has meant that we've taken down blackface content. And what we're finding is that the audiences are picking that up faster across the catalogue than we can, you know, get through the catalogue ourselves. So there have been some pretty unbelievable, you know, kind of implications that were unanticipated coming to COVID that we are trying to deal with. And we are actually fostering a lot of positive relief conversations on the other end of the spectrum as well, right? And at the moment when people just want truly, you know, kind of relief, extreme escape content, which could be anything as you know, crazy as my floor is lava, right? Really, there was a moment where everybody just wanted that type of content. Tiger King as well is an example of true escapist content. We're seeing some quite surprising kind of viewing patterns as well.
Thank you. That's phenomenal. It goes to the question of culture, and I guess that's what Zoe was sharing. And I know, Michael Cannon-Brookes, that certainly with Atlassian, culture is everything. You and I were having a conversation just recently about the impact of culture within that organisation. And when you think about these companies in the digital world, Zoe, that that influence the rest of the world. I always find it odd that you have a narrative within Silicon Valley, you have a narrative, within fundamentalist Christian communities, and then you have a completely different narrative in Washington. And this perhaps goes to that question or the statement that you were making earlier about it being different countries within one, different tribes within one. Reconciling that is, something that I still haven't been able to manage, but the influence that culture has, American culture has on everyone, has been so substantial over such a long period of time. Do you think that it's waning?
Look, I think there's a school of thought that the, American exceptionalism is waning, which I think goes to one of your earlier questions around sort of hope and the great American dream. But I still have that paused on the shelf for the moment.
Fair enough.
I think, the degree of resilience and the capacity of communities to bounce back, reinvent, is something that's very hard to predict. Because some of those communities in the US, as I was sort of alluding to, exist not in isolation, but they exist within their own cultural paradigm. They're not necessarily intimately connected with each other. People who live in, rural areas of Ohio don't necessarily care less what's happening on Broadway. People kind of exist where they live. I mean, I think that from a social media web-based sort of perspective, that's kind of an important point too in terms of communicating to people, that communication has to happen where people exist. I think we've seen that in the COVID-19 communication in Australia, for example, where particular multicultural communities have totally missed out on the messaging, because the way it's being communicated is not the way that they receive information. Young people, I mean, I'm sort of amazed that there's not some massive blanket government information campaign going on TikTok or Snapchat, because that's where people are. You have to deliver the information where they're going to receive it. The other point about the large social media companies, and really we're sort of talking about Facebook, is that there's a very fine balance between controlling the information that people are receiving and sort of making sure that that information is true, and propagandizing information for people, or sort of overtly controlling the information that people receive. And then people have to be given some capacity to receive, filter and analyze and make decisions on that information themselves. And so from that perspective, I can understand some of the pushback from those social media companies around control. But I still feel that in terms of, it's interesting, isn't it, how recently coined the term fake news is, but what a ubiquitous term that is now, and how many sort of different manifestations of that there are, that we need to find a way through being able to make sure that the information that people are receiving is right, so that it doesn't skew people's viewpoints and indeed people's voting intentions.
Thank you. Just on the point in terms of Australia and COVID, Glenda Corporal asks, what are your views on living in lockdown in Australia, and how has Australia coped with COVID-19 compared to other countries?
Well, having been in lockdown in stage 4 in Melbourne now for several weeks, I would love to be able to go more than 5 kilometres from my house, especially having travelled around the world pretty much non-stop for the last 15 years. However, from a personal perspective, I understand and agree with that approach. I think, sort of reflecting on this, that perhaps it says something about the cultural differences between the two countries. In the US, where there is a much more of a sort of expectation of small government, a desire for less government influence and interference, perhaps it would be more difficult to implement a really tight lockdown because of the degree of pushback that you would get from some people about that. Also in Australia, clearly we have a much smaller population, although we're spread over, vast areas. But perhaps that makes it more manageable. I think that, unfortunately, we've seen that political partisanship come out during the process, and I don't mean from the politicians themselves, I mean from people and community. And again, that in part goes to the way that it's discussed on social media and the level of polarisation among people that unfortunately in conversations tend to go from 1 to 100 very quickly these days. And there's not a lot of capacity to have just a considered conversation with someone that you disagree with. So from that perspective, it's become quite combative. But yeah, I just, obviously I'm in touch with a lot of friends in the US who have been enduring some degree of lockdown for some time. But in a way, I feel like the lockdown that we're seeing now in Victoria is more enforced with fines and those sorts of things. And for whatever reason, the majority of people are tolerating that. And I think perhaps that goes to some cultural differences within us.
Thank you. We've received a question from Nikila Evanti, the Executive Director of the Women's Working Group in Indonesia. Nikila, do you want to ask your question?
Hello, this is earlier in the morning now in Jakarta, Indonesia. So I just want to know what is when the gender perspective on news when you deliver the message to the community. So that's my question about that.
So the question would be, when you're choosing stories and delivering stories, the lens you put on it, the gender lens you put on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, the ABC particularly has introduced a project in fairly recent history called 50-50, which aims to make sure that within the ABC stories there is a 50-50 gender balance in terms of who is speaking. However, I think it goes further than that because it's to do with, and this is my personal view, it's to do with how women and men are portrayed within the coverage. So, if you do we need to sort of get a gender balance in terms of the experts that we're using or the business leaders that we're using, rather than portraying the genders in particular stereotypical roles. So I think that's the first thing. From my perspective, I mean, as a female field reporter who spend a lot of time out in the field talking to people, I tend to gravitate to talking to women a lot anyway. And therefore that tends to illuminate a female perspective on things. And that's, I think that's just a factor of being a woman working in those sorts of environments. And, I've done a lot of work in the developing world, and often as you would know, the women are more prominent in families, for example, than men in some ways, and are the ones who will speak up. And so that's something to capitalise on in those sorts of environments as a journalist. And often it can be more illuminating, and sometimes women will sort of, if I could describe it as, give more in an interview to another woman than perhaps in some of those more patriarchal environments than a man would. So it's kind of an organic thing from that perspective, but it is something that I'm aware of, and I think a lot of, especially international journalists, are quite aware of, trying to get more women into our coverage. And certainly in DC, we would often go looking for female experts in various fields, and because they're there, but sometimes you need to just sort of think in that way before you approach setting up a story.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Nikila, for joining us and for the question. Hannah Gee's a master's student at the University of Sydney. Hannah, you had a question as well.
Sure. Thanks, Zoe. I was just wondering, do you think that there are any issues in journalism that are issues but are not getting attention? We see things like fake news and media ownership and media monopolies, and there are a lot of other issues in journalism that do get a lot of discussion time. But do you think that there are any issues from your perspective, either internationally or domestically here in Australia, that just aren't getting the attention that they need or deserve?
Yeah, so I think there's one really big one, and it is getting some attention, but I think it needs more. And that is the world over, the gradual reduction of local coverage in favour of national coverage. And what that feeds, and what it has fed in the US and is feeding in Australia, is much more partisan, much more sort of streamed delivery of news. So it creates that situation where if you're a Fox News viewer, you watch Fox and you consume, most of your news from that kind of outlet. If you're a viewer of MSNBC, you view that, you probably read the New York Times, and that's all you receive. And it's probably unlikely that you would be receiving any rigorous or cohesive local coverage that's relevant just to your community. Perhaps your city might still have a decent paper, for example, but the reduction in staffing in regional and state-based news outlets in the US, I think, is a real problem. And I think that in Australia, we're starting to see it as well. Well, not starting to see it, we're seeing it in a really negative way too, where there's no rigorous lens applied to what's happening in small towns or even larger regional cities. Who's going to the courts in those cities for the sort of day-to-day court cases? Who's covering council meetings? Who's even giving an opportunity for the local member in, Mudgee to get their say on something? Even back when I was working for, let's say, the Country Hour, when I was presenting the Country Hour in Victoria in the mid-90s, we would routinely have the member for Shepparton or Goulburn Murray on the program, for example. We would routinely talk to those local politicians, council members, police, whoever, to figure out what stories were happening in that town or region, because we had reporters there who were connected with them. And the ABC still has that, which is great, but you can't sort of have a dynamic environment where when you only have really one media organisation operating in a space. And it means that not only are we missing sort of important stories that are in the public interest in regard to, things like the behaviour of local councils and those sorts of things, but we're also just missing telling stories about daily life and sort of highlighting the importance of the differences within us and the way that people live in different places. And I think that's a huge loss for the cultural fabric of countries. It's very worrying to me. I think that there are opportunities around certainly using the internet to create those spaces so that people can access their local news in different ways. But it still requires money and profitability. And so this is like an intractable problem. But I think, we become worse every day as a society as that tapers off, when the only news that you're getting is national news. So the only story that you're going to hear is one that is big enough that you hear it on a national bulletin or read it in a national newspaper. And that's going to be what? A shark attack, some terrible corruption, a huge, horrible domestic violence, murder. What about all the other things that are happening in those places? So, yeah, I think that's our big challenge, actually.
And do you think that, is it possible that those conversations, those smaller local conversations, have been taken over by citizen journalists telling their own stories and sharing their own conversations via social media, via Twitter, Twitter in itself, we haven't touched on that at all. We have a president that, communicates directly with his audience via Twitter, and it's the source of breaking news in many regards. Is it because people are telling their own stories and not having them filtered by journalists?
Well, I think people use Twitter. I think there's a particular kind of person that's on Twitter. There's a lot of journalists, there's a lot of academics, there's a lot of politicians. It's sort of like a particular stream of society that's on Twitter. So we're all kind of talking to each other. I find Twitter very useful as a sort of a news feed. So if you follow the right people or organisations, you can jump on Twitter and very quickly figure out what's happening in the world. When there's a fast-breaking news event, you can certainly use it to curate content to see what's happening on the ground. So if comms are up, a natural disaster, a mass shooting, something like that, you can sort of quickly start to get a sense of the picture. But it's very hard to gauge the accuracy of some of that information. And I think that, Facebook groups, for example, have also play a part in this, where communities have sort of pulled together their groups so that they can talk to each other about what's happening in their very local area. And I think that there's some benefit in that, but it tends to be kind of a little bit too small. It's kind of like, well, where can I get, X for my pet or whatever, rather than the sort of actual stories of what's happening in a community. So I think those two things are quite different. And, people sort of telling you what's happening on Twitter as something happens in front of them is quite different to sort of a crafted storytelling approach.
Fantastic. Now, if you do want to ask a question, please raise your hand or use one of the emojis at the bottom of the screen and my team will pick it up and let me know. We have Holly Ransom with us and she's going to take us back into American politics. So Holly, did you want to ask your question?
Good morning, everyone. Zoe, thank you for your time this morning. Always great to hear your insights. So much I want to ask you about with regards to the US right now. But I'm intrigued for kind of how you see this playing out post-November. And particularly, I guess one of the things I'm hearing more and more from classmates that I'm studying with over in the US and just observing and listening is that really, irrespective of what fork in the road America goes down, the likelihood of them returning to a state of calm or the kind of disappearance of the civil unrest that we've been seeing on the streets for months now is highly unlikely. You've got a president that's unlikely to exit off it gracefully, probably going to continue to linger in the Republican Party long after the election, should it be that America picks Biden. And I'm just intrigued for your commentary on sort of what you see as the ramifications at a more community level across the country. You've obviously been on the front line of these conversations. You've met, and I've followed a lot of your stories, reporting from meeting Trump supporters and tracking this journey for so long. But I'm interested for your commentary just around the level of tension and how America emerges from this election with regards to, I guess more that community unrest. And there's just this level of disunity and disconnection that just seems to be pervading in a way we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting, and it kind of evolved for me as a perspective that, and I realised probably around the midterms, that one of the things that was really feeding that anger or that division was the fact that people who voted for Trump felt that their decision wasn't respected by Democrats, that they were treated like as if their democratic decision-making was wrong or illegitimate. And that makes people really angry. That whole sense of the Democrats trying to get Trump out of office by some sort of shady means, via the Mueller report or impeachment or whatever, was read by a lot of his base as, you didn't accept the decision that we made. We won the election fair and square. Okay, Hillary won the popular vote, but the Electoral College is what it is. And so we won it. So get over it and, let us move on. So from that perspective, I think there's a lot of simmering anger. I think that if Trump gets voted out, then obviously those people are going to remain very angry, and they're probably going to feel like he's been done over in some way. So then it creates a couple of questions. Does Trump go quietly? Well, no. I don't subscribe to the he won't leave office view. I think that's kind of a bit of a long bow, but I think hanging around sort of, fostering some simmering dissent within the party is quite likely. I also think that, the Republicans have a kind of an interesting conundrum now, because having been pretty doubtful about Trump in the early stages and then in the end accepted him, they've in effect embraced that 35% that represents his base, and they're not going to want to let those people go. So what do you do after the election if Trump doesn't win and he's kind of kicking around, pulling strings within the innards of the party? Do you, as the Republican Party, say, okay, no, we want a clean break from this, we're going to move on, and then you further disenfranchise those people who elected Trump, making them even more angry? You also lose that 35% voting base. And then your next question is, well, where do you go as a Republican Party? So a lot of those people who opposed Trump in the early stages and then kind of gave up opposing him went away. So the Paul Ryans, the Bob Corkers, obviously John McCain's gone. So a lot of those people are no longer in the picture. And then so where do you go? Where do you go for leadership? Which of those potential leaders will be acceptable to both Trump's base and the more middle ground of the Republican Party? And then there's always the potential that Trump will try to get the nomination again in 2024. So there's a whole lot of variables in that. And then the counterpoint to everything I've just said is, what if Donald Trump wins? Then you've got 8 years of Donald Trump. You've essentially consolidated his power over the party. And, just in the context of this book that I'm writing, I'm actually in a section around the Never Trumpers of 2015-16, who were all against Donald Trump. And there was, a lot of pushback initially around his rhetoric on things like immigration and gender and stuff like that. But one by one, they fell into line, because in the end, they either got steamrolled by Trump, were sort of humiliated out of the race by Trump, or just realised that he was going to win. So then embraced him based on the fact that he could deliver them the White House. So, if you fast forward to now and you say, well, he loses in 2020, I'm at a bit of a loss as to who actually steps up, who can kind of put that party back together retain Trump's base and sort of lead them out in any sort of cohesive way. I think it's a very interesting set of questions, because the Republicans kind of, in the end, they had to, well, those who stayed embraced someone who's not really a Republican. And now that what they've created is something quite different to what they were before.
What's really interesting has been Trump's position in terms of immigrants, talent-based immigrants, you know, so with the H-1B visa changes, you can't imagine the impact that has had on different parts of the United States. But obviously it's something that has been important to the party, to the base, something that is important to him. If he does win again, those sort of policies that, his reaction to Silicon Valley, his reaction to China, his relationship with the Middle East, they're all still waiting there. What's going to be interesting is what takes priority and what promises he makes during the election. What's your sense of, other than, what it takes to win, what's your sense of where his priorities might lie, given what he's been talking about recently?
Well, he's very into ticking boxes. So he kind of, and this is just my read, but he kind of benchmarks his performance based on having delivered things that he said that he would do. So in terms of the 2016 campaign, I mean, there were things like tax reform. There were things like pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, rolling back environmental regulation, getting right-wing judges onto the Supreme Court and into the lower courts. He's managed to tick those things. The things that he has failed to tick will be, he'll either have to sort of bench those things or put them back up again for this is unfinished business. So the things are the sort of ongoing China trade situation. That plays really well with his base, by the way. So while, as sort of global people, we all recoil from the idea of a global trade war, the people that I've spoken to who back Donald Trump, farmers and the like, even if their businesses are in the short term negatively affected by that trade war, broadly they back that because they think just simply China's too powerful, has been for too long, we need to take a bit of that power back. But so there's that, and there's the Mexican wall general immigration situation. I mean, he's had some, sort of spectacular fails around the Muslim ban, for example. I mean, it's hard to even remember back to these things now, and that was right at the beginning of 2017. But if you recall, this is what I mean about how fast the news cycle is. Like, we've kind of all been like spinning tops for the last 4 years. But remember, like, the airports shut down. There were protests all over the US about the idea of stopping people from particular countries coming in. But then, as you mentioned, Maria, that was very much the high-skilled visa thing was definitely something that he pulled from the Australian context, and he's said that. He likes the idea of being able to foster high-skilled immigration and push back low-skilled immigration. I think he thinks that that's a sort of reasonable compromise. The other problem that I think he has is that, and we talked a lot earlier about jobs, he promised to deliver jobs to come back into some of these deindustrialized communities, particularly those that were reliant on steel, automobile manufacturing, general sort of things like white goods and stuff like that. He hasn't quite been able to deliver that. And that's kind of really core to his thinking, and I think he'll see that as a real fail. Again, if we talk about the fact that most people vote based on the hip pocket, especially in those so-called flyover states, to me, that's where he's going to be putting his promises around what, this is what I can do for you. over the next term?
Well, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We've covered Trump, we've covered what's happening globally, we've covered, the pandemic, we've covered your return to Australia, we had a chat about Japan, and it's a reflection of the rich and diverse life that you have led and the incredible stories that you have shared and brought back to Australia. And that's the power of a foreign correspondent, being able to see these stories with the perspective and the lens of an Australian. And for that, we're very grateful for the incredible body of work that is associated with you. And with that, I'd like to offer you our sincere thanks. And before we all go, my team's going to put up a poll, and it's just one question. So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute and just clicking the button. Zoe, you're always welcome at Advance. We are all about people who are Australians who work and live overseas, come and go at different times of their life. And we are very, very grateful for the perspectives that you shared today. I thank every one of you for joining us today and for the rich narrative, the questions that you put to us. If there are any other questions, send them through and we'll make sure that Zoe gets them, and we'll see if we can't integrate them into the summary. After the session today, we'll take the recording and tidy it up a little bit, and we'll also do a summary and send that out to you. Thank you again for joining Advance, and I hope you have a really lovely day, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everyone.